Welcome to EFO Talks. We are welcoming today Dr. Giorgio Musso, who is a researcher at the University of Rome 3. Dr. Musso, if one looks carefully, one ends up finding some hints that some war is happening in East Africa, in Sudan, where they already had multiple civil wars. They tried a revolution. South Sudan became independent in 2011, but this didn't solve their problems. There is an ongoing war in the Republic of Sudan, where the capital Khartoum is said to be a pile of rubble. People are fleeing because the infrastructures have been destroyed west of Khartoum in Darfur. People have been dying by the thousands, yet it is hard. One has to look and research for information. So our mission here is to give our readers a good background to make sense of the implications. Can you give us maybe a picture of what the situation is?
Thank you for having me. I will try to explain. Actually, I started researching on Sudan back in 2007. So it's been quite a lot of years. And when I started doing research on Sudan, Sudan was still a united country. Now, let me begin by saying that this is entirely a civil war within the Republic of Sudan. So South Sudan has nothing to do with this. South Sudan had its own civil conflict that erupted in 2013. Some sort of peace agreement was concluded in 2018, and it's almost stabilized. South Sudan nowadays, there are still some minor rebel groups in some southwestern regions that haven't signed the peace agreement. But to give a clear picture, let's say that the conflict we are speaking of is within the Republic of Sudan. And it has very much to do with the revolution you were referring to. Of course, to say that South Sudan has nothing to do doesn't imply saying that, let's say, the current conflict does not have a genealogy. There's a long history of conflict in Sudan. The country has been hit by multiple civil wars. Even before its independence, actually, Sudan became independent in 1956. And already in 1955, some disturbances or localized armed conflict had erupted in the south. What about Darfur? Darfur is a region within the Republic of Sudan. It is a region that has a long history, also, I would say, of independent statehood, because Darfur, in what we call the Middle Ages, was a sultanate. It's a region roughly the size of France, so we call it a region, but we must realize that we are dealing with what was once the largest state in Africa. In terms of area, Sudan was the largest state in Africa. Of course, after the secession of South Sudan, this is no more the case, but Sudan nonetheless is a very big country. It's a very large state, and this has to do with the conflict, because the conflict has a center-periphery dynamic in it. Darfur is the westernmost region, so it borders Chad, Libya, and the Central African Republic. And historically, it holds grievances against the central government in Khartoum. The current conflict erupted in April 2023, basically between the army, so the regular armed force of Sudan, that go by the name of Sudan Armed Forces, and the paramilitary militia, whose name is Rapid Support Forces, which is led by Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, known as Hemeti by his nickname, who was, by the way, at that time, the deputy to the head of state. So this militia had its own autonomy because it had been founded initially by the central government as a counterinsurgency militia in Darfur at around 2005 to counter the local insurgency in Darfur. And then it was regularized in 2013. That's when it took the name Rapid Support Forces. And it was given in 2013 by the then head of state, Omar al-Bashir, basically two tasks. It was charged with patrolling the borders and keeping track of the different flows.
Well, I mean,
Yeah,
the borders where? Between the
of
Central
the
Republic and Darfur, or the borders externally?
no, the external borders of the
Okay.
state,
Hence with
particularly.
Chad and Libya.
Yeah, exactly,
Okay.
particularly in the western areas. And then it was also meant to serve as a, let's say, Praetorian Guard for al-Bashir himself.
Mhm.
In this capacity, as border guards, it's plausible that the RSF also received funds indirectly from the European Union, because at that time there was a process called the Khartoum process. It was one of these processes through which the European Union tries to outsource migration management or external borders management to African countries. There were two processes, parallel processes at the same time: the process of the Rabat process for the Western migration tracks and the Khartoum process. But this is another story. So these rapid support forces grew in power as an autonomous militia affiliated with the state, but independent from the regular army. They have their heartland in Darfur, and ethnically they are mainly composed of Arab tribes in Darfur. So to make an oversimplification, which nonetheless has some truth in it, in Darfur we have tribes that trace their lineage to an Arab descent, and we have autochthonous tribes that define themselves more as African than as Arabs. And this is also a racial dimension to what has been happening in Darfur in the last 20 years and what is happening now. So being based mainly in Darfur as their homeland, the RSF started to exploit the gold mines in Darfur. Darfur is actually rich in gold, like other parts of Sudan. Since Sudan lost 2/3 of its oil reserves when South Sudan declared independence, the government of Sudan compensated the loss of oil revenues by greatly increasing the exports of gold from the country. And we've been living in the last decade, the value, the prices of gold on international markets have surged. So the government of Sudan managed to exploit gold more than it did before, but some of these mines actually were managed privately somehow by the RSF. And it is in their capacity as entrepreneurs or entrepreneurs in the mining sectors that the RSF also established a link with the Wagner Group, the famous Russian Wagner
This
Group.
was my next question. If there are external implications from, so go ahead, please.
Yeah, there is a connection, definitely, because I mean, the Wagner Group that now, after the attempted coup against Putin last year, goes by the name of Africa Corps. So they haven't been disbanded; they have just been relabeled. Is very much established in the Central African Republic. Actually, this is my personal opinion, somehow the influence of the Wagner Group in Africa has been overstated in many instances, but not when we come to the Central African Republic. That is definitely a state where the Wagner Group has a real influence. And the Central African Republic, as I said before, borders Darfur. So somehow the RSF established links with this Russian militia because they were close, and the RSF traded in gold probably with them or exchanged gold for weapons, even though most of the gold that is mined in Darfur is traded through the United Arab Emirates. And this is the most important connection for the RSF is the UAE. But we can maybe go in depth on this topic later. I just wanted to give you a portrait of the RSF. So what happened is that at the beginning of 2023, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, who is the head of the regular military and also the head of state, tried to integrate forcefully the RSF within the army. So Burhan didn't want to accept anymore this dualism in terms of armed forces, and also this dualism at the top of power with Hemeti, the chief of the RSF. And so he tried to ostensibly, as part of an effort towards stabilization, let's say, I wouldn't say democratization, because Burhan had just made a coup d'etat against the civilian, but we may talk about the revolution after. He tried to integrate forcefully the RSF within the army. The RSF refused to do this because, of course, being integrated within the army means that you are put under the line of command of the army. So Hemeti would have lost his primacy over the RSF, and they would have lost their independence. They didn't accept, and so the Battle of Khartoum exploded between the Sudanese armed forces and the RSF. So I'm quite hesitant usually to call this a civil conflict, because this is actually a conflict between two armed forces within the same state, in which the civilians are always the victims of conflict. But in this case, the civilians are really between a rock and a hard place, because they are just they feel they cannot meaningfully control or somehow do something to change the situation. Actually, the two actors of the war are two military actors.
Yes. And how about the population? How is it coping with this double military conflict? How are they affected?
Yeah, so the effects in humanitarian terms on this population have been a disaster. Sudan is now the largest humanitarian catastrophe in the world. There have almost more than 1/3 of the population is displaced, either within the country or outside the country. Those who could fled, actually. Keep in mind that this current war has something different from the previous wars that Sudan experienced, which is the fact that it hit the capital. All of the conflict that Sudan had undergone in previous decades had happened in the peripheral regions, either in the south or in the east or in Darfur. This is the first war in the history of the country that destroys the capital.
Yeah.
And we are talking about a city of millions of people.
It's a big city, Khartoum.
Yeah, it's a very big city. It is actually three cities in one. because Khartoum is divided by the Nile. So there are the two branches of the Nile, the Blue Nile and the White Nile, that converge in Khartoum, and then the Nile goes on as a single river towards Egypt. So we have like these three slices of land that compose the so-called three cities. Khartoum is a very big city, is a modern city with skyscrapers. It had experienced the oil boom since the late 90s. So it's also a wealthy city, and particularly, it's a city with a thriving middle class, with a lively civil society. Actually, Sudan has experienced in its history 3 successful civil uprising against military dictatorship. Sudan is the only Arab country where the population has been able for 3 consecutive times, in 1964, in 1985, and in 2019, to oust military dictators from power. So the civil society in Khartoum has been very much the backbone of society, like the Sudanese Lawyers Association, the Sudanese Doctors Association, the Teachers Associations. It was a city, as I said, with a thriving middle class of journalists, of university professors, of professionals, etc. All of these people have gone away. Only the poorest people have been stuck in the area, in the capital, and they are coping with very much with a sense of with very tight solidarity. There are these neighborhood-based bodies called emergency response rooms that are formed by civil society activists to help the people to cope with the conflict. And for example, if there hasn't been in Khartoum up to now a severe food shortage, I mean, there is food shortage, but there's no famine up to now in the capital, is due to the fact that these activists managed to get funds from the diaspora and buy food, and they created these sort of neighborhood kitchens where people can go and take food. This, for example, is not happening in rural areas where already now, where we have millions of people, according to the UN, at risk of famine, and we already have about 1 million people suffering severe famine right now while we are speaking. This is not the case, fortunately, in Khartoum, but the social fabric of the capital has been shattered. And I don't know how long will it take once the conflict is over to rebuild everything. We have, like, for example, fighters, mercenary fighters from Chad and from the Central African Republic that entered the city with the RSF that occupied houses. I have friends who tell me that their house in Khartoum is being occupied by foreigners. And nowadays, what we are approaching exactly in these days is another round of fighting around Khartoum, because Khartoum has been occupied by the RSF. The regular army managed to hold on their headquarters and slightly more than the army headquarters. Now the army, since early December of last year, has launched quite an effective counteroffensive. They have retaken a region in the center-south, and they have been marching on to Khartoum. And according to the news that I can read, they are approaching the cities. They are 4 kilometers from the city center. So either the RSF leave the city without fighting because they realize they cannot halt the advance of the army, or if they decide to fight street by street, we are going to see again a Battle of Khartoum in the forthcoming days.
Okay, so this is mainly an internal conflict.
Yeah.
As you see it, there is not much or not at all influence from the outside.
No, there is definitely an influence
Okay,
from the outside.
so what is it, the influence? Because what we're trying to do is to take something local and understand how it fits with everything else.
Yeah, the bigger picture. Yeah, of course.
Yes.
Now, so when it comes to conflict, I'm generally of the idea that the causes of conflict are always mainly internal.
Mhm.
Of course, if we are dealing with an internal conflict, not an interstate conflict, like is the case with Sudan now. Then, of course, external influences
Mhm.
intervene, and they can lead to an intensification of conflict. They can lead to a conflict becoming more intractable, and they can actually make it more difficult to reach a mediation between the parties that are fighting on the internal front. And of course, it can prolong the conflict. So, what political scientists tell us is the fact that conflicts that become internationalized are more difficult to conclude and are longer. And this is what is happening. I mean, this started as an internal conflict, and then of course both parties have their own supporters. Um, the Sudanese army is supported by Egypt because the Sudanese army has a strong historical relationship with the Egyptian army. And since in Egypt we have a military regime in power, it's natural due to the ties that the Egyptian army has with the Sudanese army. I mean, many Sudanese officers, for example, have been trained in Egypt. They have family ties. They know Sudanese and Egyptian officers. They know each other very well. So the Sudanese army is being backed by Egypt. Is I would say initially quietly, now not so quietly backed by Turkey. Turkey has recently given drones, its famous drones, to the Sudanese army, and these drones were really useful in the recapturing of towns in the last 2 months by the Sudanese army. Then we could say on the sidelines, Saudi Arabia, and of course its main allied superpower, the United States. I would say on the sidelines because the United States and Saudi Arabia tried to mediate talks since the beginning,
Mhm.
quite ineffectively. So I would
Mhm.
say that Sudan proves that we are no more in a world where superpowers can change things at their own will. Uh, but if, of course, we should ascribe Saudi Arabia to one of the two fronts, it's closer to the army than to the RSF.
Okay.
Now, the main backer of the RSF, as I said, is the UAE, the United Arab Emirates. It's
Mm.
well known that the United Arab Emirates allowed the RSF to operate offices, social media, lobbying campaign from their territory. It's quite well known that the RSF allowed, the UAE allowed the RSF to trade their gold, and also that the United Arab Emirates sent weapons to the RSF. Why so? Well,
Yes.
the RSF they have a link actually with both Saudi Arabia and the UAE, because when Saudi Arabia and the UAE fought their war in Yemen, these are countries that spend billions of dollars in military equipment, but they always struggle to find people that want to fight wars. Actually, the Saudis or Emirati society, they do not want to go young people. They live a wealthy life. They don't want to go to fight. So these governments always struggle to find soldiers. And Sudan sends soldiers to fight in Yemen on behalf of the Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And particularly, most of these soldiers belong to the RSF. So it's due to the Yemen issue that the RSF established this link with the UAE. And
Yes.
then the UAE has its own regional agenda. So the UAE intervened in Ethiopia with a mixture of economic, military, political, diplomatic cooperation. It's regional politics. We are living in an era of regional powers. As I said before, superpowers are struggling to control conflicts in remote regions. And we are living in an era of middle powers. Countries like Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Iran, the UAE, if they are rich enough, they can gain a very strong influence in their region, because superpowers prefer, and this is going to increase with Trump, that doesn't want to send American boots on the ground. So superpowers increasingly rely on regional partners to manage conflicts.
Yes.
And this also gives regional powers their form of leverage and some scope of autonomy. The UAE is one of the most active regional powers in the Horn of Africa and also in North Africa, because let's not forget what is happening in Libya. What's been
It's
happening in
not over.
Libya
Yes.
in the last 15 years? We've had the UAE intervening heavily, Turkey intervening, Egypt intervening. There's no ideological or political logic behind this.
Okay.
It's purely an issue of regional hegemony. If you look at Libya and Sudan, you will find that in Libya, let me just say this, you will find that in Libya, Turkey is supporting the government in Tripoli, and Egypt and the UAE are supporting the Haftar faction in Benghazi. But
Yeah.
if you look at Sudan, which is a neighboring country to Libya, you will find that Egypt and Turkey are supporting the Sudanese army, and the UAE is supporting the RSF. So there's no issue of ideologic alignment. It's just middle power game for regional hegemony, and case by case, these governments, they choose the horse they want to bet on.
So is it sheer power or is it linked to resources?
Of course, the two issue intertwine.
Yeah.
Um,
Because as you
yeah,
said, in Darfur, there is enormous amounts of
yeah,
resources.
in Darfur there's gold, there's fertile land in Sudan, there's water. The main interest of Egypt, of course, is the control of the Nile waters. But it's an issue of resources, economic resources, but also of influence, so of strategic influence in the region, and having a foothold Sudan is a crucible of the region. It stands
Yes.
at the crossroad between the Sahel, the Nile Valley, the Horn of Africa, and the Red Sea region, and also somehow the Great Lakes of Africa. So Sudan is placed in a strategic place. It has a not very long but meaningful enough trade of coast on the Red Sea, which is one of the reasons why I didn't mention Russia and Ukraine while we were talking about external influences in this
Yes.
conflict. Let me just briefly elaborate on that. Oddly enough, Russia supports both. Russia has ties with both parties,
Okay.
because on the one hand, Russia wanted permissions from the Sudanese government to build a military port on the Red Sea in Port Sudan, close to Port Sudan. So, and Russia still has this ambition. So it doesn't want to alienate the sympathies of the Sudanese government or the regular armed forces. On the other hand, Russia had these ties to the RSF due to the Wagner Group. So they also had this connection with the RSF, which is the reason why Ukraine, at least in the first months of the conflict, sent some personnel to assist the Sudanese armed forces. At least what we know, Ukrainian special forces. I mean, there have been multiple claims of the fact that Ukrainian special forces fought along the Sudanese armed forces in the first battle of Khartoum. This is not confirmed. That what we
That
know
was
is
in
that
2023?
yeah.
Yes.
So while the conflict in Ukraine was already underway, which is quite surprising.
Yes.
But what we know, at least, is the fact that Ukraine sent some military technician for the maintenance of aircraft and other military equipment in Sudan. So there has been also a Ukrainian involvement in this conflict. Although I wouldn't say, I mean, it's been very much overstated in my opinion, since I do not believe that Ukraine had, given its own situation, the military or economic resources to devote a lot of attention and resources to intervening in Sudan.
Well, this is a great introduction. Many thanks.
Yeah.
I hope we could move forward and go deeper in the various implications of this. Do you see a possibility for resolution in the near
So it's,
future?
I wouldn't say in the near future. Actually, there have been mediation attempts. There have been diplomatic attempts, and I have spoken with a few diplomats who went a few months ago, I believe 3-4 months ago, in Sudan. They reached out to the parties, to both parties, and they were welcomed with kindness, but with the same kindness, they were told, "This is the time of war. We have no intention of talking. We have no intention of entering into peace talks. We believe we can. Both parties believe they can fight. They can win the fight militarily, and much more now, given the fact that the government, I mean, the military, the army has managed to recapture a lot of ground. I don't see a solution in sight. What happens is that the RSF are still very much entrenched in Western Sudan, in Darfur. There is only one major city, El Fasher, which is controlled by the army. El Fasher has been besieged for almost the last year, even though we haven't heard on medias about the siege of El Fasher, but the situation there is a catastrophe. So the most likely scenario, to my mind, is a sort of Libyan scenario, where you have this de facto partition of the state with the Western Sudan, Darfur, that is controlled, that keeps being controlled by the RSF, which are strong enough militarily to keep the territory and autonomous enough economically to run the semblance of governance in this territory. And then you have the capital, Central and Eastern Sudan, controlled by the army, which is, by the way, a dysfunctional situation. So you have the de facto fragmentation of the state. I used to call this, I mean, when I usually do my presentations in these months about Sudan, I used to call this a war of disintegration, because this war is disintegrating the Sudanese state as we know it. And what is frightening is that we are seeing more and more wars of disintegration in this region. What's been happening in Syria since 2011 up to a few months ago? And I mean, I don't have an exact, I do not master the Syrian situation enough, but I'm not sure that the government controls the whole of the territory. what's happening in Yemen, what's happening in Libya. So we have this kind of fragmented states due to conflicts that are not resolved by a peace process. Why so? Because there's less and less investment in peace by the international community. So there are, usually conflicts. Africa has experienced dozens of conflicts since the 1990s, but usually a conflict ended with a peace mediation and a peace agreement. And then there was the issue of the implementation of the peace agreement, and of course, a big mess when it came to demobilization, reintegration of soldiers, etc., power sharing, election. I mean, things were not easy at all, but at least there was the idea that a war has to end. Now, increasingly enough, we are dealing with this kind of never-ending conflict. When you reach a situation of a semblance of peace, without complete stability, and you have this kind of semi-private control of the territory by non-state actors like Haftar in Libya, or the Houthis in Yemen, or ISIS or the Kurds in Syria, or the RSF in Sudan.
Yeah.
And these non-state actors are simply they are backed by an economic power that comes to them by virtue of an economy of war. So they can prosper, they can be independent as long as the war continues. The RSF can continue to exploit gold mines that actually should be exploited by legitimate companies or by the state only as far as the conflict goes on. So you have this kind of war economy dynamic that actually contributes to prolong the conflict. So I don't want to give too much of a bleak scenario, but this is the way that we are seeing conflict in the global south are going. We are seeing conflict that do not end. You have seen recently the capture of Goma in the eastern DRC by the M23. The conflict in the eastern DRC has been going on for 30
If I
years.
understand, yeah. If I understand right, what you're saying is that now conflicts do not have a political logic, but
Exactly.
they only have a keep the war going logic.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, conflicts, they always have a political logic
At the
in the sense,
beginning, but
yeah, or as far as the war is the continuation of politics by other means. So these people are fighting for power, for political power, for power over the state and over the resources. The problem is that wars do not have a political solution. So war has been totally, in the last 20 years, well, I would say since September 11, war has been rehabilitated as a legitimate tool of international politics and as a legitimate tool for solving problems.
thank you, Giorgio. I very much appreciate all the explanations. We might get back to you because there is so much to understand about Africa, Western Africa in particular, and its implications with the Middle East and the Arab Peninsula. So we would love to get in touch again. And for now, many thanks. Do you have a word for the end? I don't know.
Well, it's difficult. It's complicated to approach this war, and I've been involved with Sudan, as I said at the beginning, for the last 20 years. I have a lot of ties with the country. It's been surprising to see war coming to the places where I, together with many friends and colleagues, I had been. So I'm a historian by training, and if we look at the present most often looks bleak, but history is full of surprises. And when the Bashir regime was overthrown in 2019, it was a surprise. And so I do not expect peace to come overnight to Sudan, but I hope that this current war will come to an end, and maybe a new leadership, a more enlightened leadership could take over the country, because people deserve it. And
Yes.
they have shown, even during the conflict, they have shown how extraordinary they are, because actually what the emergency response rooms, small civil society organizations, neighborhood committees are doing in Sudan, particularly if we consider the fact that international humanitarian agencies are almost absent from the country, and not because they want to be absent. Of course, there are other priorities at the international level, Ukraine, Gaza, etc. But the fact is that Sudan is unsafe for most humanitarian operators. So in the absence of most humanitarian agencies, the Sudanese have shown a remarkable resilience and capacity to hold tight in the face of this catastrophic war. Okay.
Let's end on this beautiful note that the population is resisting, that the population is showing unthought of resources, and we'll keep an eye on this part of the world and try to understand more and more. Thank you very much for participating, and we will speak
Thank
soon
you.
again. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, Roberta.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.